Since we're about to see the release of the game Suicide Squad Kill the Justice League, I figured I would do something that I haven't done in a while. Well, two things, actually. The first is actually getting into Sony Vegas and editing a video myself. The second is talking about a video game. Since the Suicide Squad game is being made by Rocksteady Studios, I wanted to go back and evaluate a game that they put out in 2009 that completely changed the way we look at how to make a video game based on a superhero. Let's go back and have a look at Batman: Arkham Asylum. It goes without saying that just about everybody worldwide knows who Batman is. He is one of the three most popular superheroes of all time. And on top of his popularity in the comic book sphere, he's also been a titan at the box office, on top of also having one of the most beloved animated series of any comic book character in existence. Back in 2009, it really seemed like the only medium that Batman hadn't conquered in entertainment was the world of video games. Now, there have been several Batman video games before the year 2009, but none of them had the impact that Arkham Asylum had. Now, before we get into why it had such an impact, let me talk about how this game, in some ways, came out of nowhere. Now, Rocksteady Studios wasn't exactly that well known of a game development house. In fact, they had only done one major release video game prior to this one, and it was one that honestly showed how much potential they had as a development house. Urban Chaos Riot Response was a first-person shooter that essentially gave you an indestructible riot shield and tasked you with the task of bringing down a violent gang of pyromaniacs, setting an entire city aflame. Now, it's sort of something that got lost in the shuffle because of all the great games that were coming out in that era of video gaming, which is when the PlayStation 2, Nintendo GameCube, and the Xbox were seeing several great video games out on a regular basis. For those of us who did play Urban Chaos, we saw that Rocksteady was essentially being overlooked, and unfairly, because the game was a fucking blast. With that said, they landed the position of a lifetime when they were chosen to develop Arkham Asylum. Most of us who were big-time gamers around the years 2007 to 2009 had first heard of Arkham Asylum when it was revealed in an issue of Game Informer. What we saw in that issue was honestly something I don't think gamers had ever seen before in a Batman game. It was gritty, it was dark, and it was an unrelenting vision of Batman's world that primarily took its inspiration straight from the comic books. On top of that, though, it still took visual inspirations and auditory inspiration from the Batman films as well, and I mean all of them in different ways. In essence, it looked like one massive love letter to everything in the Batman franchise. However, when the game actually came out, a lot of people were surprised to find that this wasn't just a fun video game where you sit around, press clicky buttons, and beat up bad guys. Now, you do press clicky buttons and beat up bad guys, but the way that the game was formatted and developed from the ground up wasn't just to be sort of a standard beat-em-up or a standard stealth game. Some people find this a little passé, but I feel like when Rocksteady said this, it held true and still holds true for the entire Arkham franchise. The entire goal was always for you, as the player, to feel like Batman, and boy howdy did they succeed at that. Part of what made Arkham Asylum so notable was that it was rather obvious that the developers took a lot of time in researching exactly how Batman operates. There were certain ideas that needed to be communicated if you're going to play as this character. The first being that he is one of the most badass hand-to-hand experts in all of comic books, and you need to pull off everything he can do. Not just a bunch of martial arts maneuvers, but properly integrate gadgets into combat as well. The second thing, of course, that you need to integrate and preserve is the idea that Batman does not kill. So you couldn't have him slitting throats and snapping necks, which of course he doesn't do in this. He might break some other things, but not your neck. The final thing is that Batman's goal is to bring down every single criminal he can get his hands on, and every time you enter a room, the basic objective is don't leave until every bad guy in there has been beaten to a pulp and completely subdued, so that they don't hurt anybody. The term that got used for this was Predator gameplay. And it's a very fitting way to describe exactly how you approach the game. In a game like Metal Gear Solid or Splinter Cell, when you play as someone like Solid Snake or Sam Fisher, the goal is basically to sneak around and get from point A to point B with as little conflict as humanly possible. And if you can have no conflict whatsoever and get through without anybody knowing you're there, good, you've succeeded in your goal. Batman, on the other hand, wants to do something different. He wants to come into a room, scare the ever-living crap out of every bad guy around them, and then beat the crap out of said bad guys so that the cops can throw them in jail and throw away the key. If you couldn't properly communicate that in a video game, this thing would have failed from the get-go. It would have just been another Unreal 3 cash grab, which, given that time, for anybody who remembers, there was a lot of those at the time. Not to mention, it was rather obvious that Rocksteady took their time with making it look and feel like a proper Batman story, where Batman acts as Batman does. When Batman walks into a room and surprises a goon, they react with absolute fear. If you're in a stealth section, you can actually observe the behavior of your targets as you pick them off one by one, and see their heart rates are starting to skyrocket, on top of them acting much more erratic. Every time Batman hits someone, or counters an attack when some poor idiot decides to be a very stupid person and try to punch him, or you slam someone into the ground, or anything like that, or if you just punch somebody in the nuts or donkey punch them, the sound effects sound like a baseball hitting a rack of ribs, which is incredibly satisfying to say the least. To put it simply, though Batman had platformers and beat-em-ups beforehand, Arkham Asylum was the first video game that you could actually describe as a Batman power fantasy, or maybe a little bit more of an apt description would be a Batman simulator. You're not just being any other schmo with a pair of fists. You are vengeance, you are the night, you are Batman. God, I've always wanted to do that. Anyway, I referenced that line for a very specific reason, by the way. You see, one thing that Rocksteady did that was probably the smartest thing that they could have done to hook people into buying the game when they announced that Batman, the Joker, and Harley Quinn would all be voiced by the same voice actors who brought them to life in Batman the Animated Series. Some people may agree with me on this, some people may not, but I am of the opinion that Kevin Conroy as Batman and Mark Hamill as the Joker really opened the door and showed the way to play these characters in the most compelling way you could. I think that without the standard that those two men set, we wouldn't have gotten a movie like The Dark Knight, which I am of the opinion is actually very inspired by the performances of Joker and Batman the Animated Series. And Dark Knight ended up becoming, and is still considered, the greatest superhero film of all time. So, Rocksteady essentially grabbed absolute icons to bring these characters to life, and it was the smartest thing that they ever could have done. Now, one thing we should probably talk about is the story. Paul Dini, who worked on Batman the Animated Series and co-created both the characters of Harley Quinn and Batman Beyond's Terry McGinnis, was brought in to pen the story. To be truthful, in going back and playing through the game, it honestly feels like a story that would be if you decided to essentially make a video game that was aimed at Batman the Animated Series fans as they have gotten older. Because most of us who watched Batman the Animated Series as kids were in our early to mid-20s by the time that this game came out. Now, it's not really a super complex story, and since the game has been out for a decade, I'm not going to worry too much about spoiling here, but I'll go ahead and throw up the spoiler warning anyway. But first, it's time to plug our quote-unquote sponsor. And this video's sponsor is GRINDSTONE Arts. Yeah, it might be a little bit cheap for me to sponsor my own video, but at the end of the day, I have to say that I'm very proud of the things that my company is going to be able to provide for you guys in the coming years. So if you have not already, pre-orders are up for certain books that you are seeing, on top of mailing lists that are open as well if you want to be notified when more campaigns go live. Not to mention, it also goes without saying that we've got a great lineup of titles, a great lineup of creators, and we're looking forward to serving you in the future. So, if you like what you're seeing or you're interested in what you're seeing, don't forget to back our books, sign up for mailing lists, and also follow us on social media for all of the updates. Now, back to the video. What happens is that the Joker gets himself caught by Batman, so that he can end up inside of Arkham Asylum. He paid for the research on a compound known as Titan. Now, Titan was developed by a doctor named Penelope Young, who works in Arkham Asylum, and was originally developed from the Venom drug that Bane uses to go from being, in this particular universe, from incredibly small to big old thick boy. Now, you overhear statements within walking around a certain part of Arkham Asylum that Dr. Young was essentially developing Titan as essentially a cure for insanity. But, of course, given that it's based on Venom, Joker knew that he could find a way to weaponize it, and essentially what the stuff does is if you shoot somebody with it, they essentially turn into a mindless version of Bane. Well, anyway, after Batman dispatches the actual Bane by literally running him over with the Batmobile, he goes on the hunt to destroy the Titan formula and figure out how this whole thing even got started. This leads him to actually save the doctor who worked on the formula from Victor Zsasz, but she ends up sadly being killed by the Joker anyway with an explosive. After this, you just follow Batman trying to stop the plot, which he eventually does after the Joker turns himself into a Titan version of himself. It's really just, in a lot of ways, a standard Joker comic book story. And it doesn't really veer into anything that I would really call boundary pushing or something along those lines. In fact, I would say one thing that's kind of disappointing about it is that there's all this great banter between Joker and Batman throughout all of it, and the boss fight against the Joker is a major letdown. Granted, one of the biggest criticisms that everybody has had about this game over time is that the boss fights really weren't that great. Mostly because it's, you fight Bane, and then you're essentially fighting Bane but dumber several times throughout the story. You get scared half to death by Scarecrow a number of times, and then you fight Joker, who actually doesn't fight half the time. He just pimp slaps you a couple times and then goes and taunts you. Anyway, Arkham Asylum came across as a whole picture as more of a gateway drug to Batman in general. Throughout the course of the game, you come across the very best of Batman's rogues gallery. You encounter Killer Croc, the Joker, Victor Zsasz, Harley Quinn, Bane, the Scarecrow, and Poison Ivy. There's also hints of other villains as well as you go throughout the island, like Calendar Man, Two-Face, Maxie Zeus, Clayface, and more. You actually see Clayface. Sort of. It's complicated. Anyway, one of the highlights of the exploration in this game is actually finding the patient tape interviews with several of these super criminals. A lot of them really give this great dive into the psyche of these villains. And as you collect them, you can just listen to them at your own pace if you're more invested in where the action is taking you at the time. It's one of those things where it's a game that has a lot of really good and really in-depth flavor text that you can just devour whenever you want. And this was something that I really felt a lot of games during this generation were really nailing. We've got all this great lore, but you can dive into it at your own pace. You don't have to feel like you have to stop everything and listen to Killer Croc threaten to eat somebody. If you don't want to listen to it right then and there, you can just keep with the story, and then later on, when you want to take a second to listen, do it at your own pace. Do it at your own leisure, what have you. I love stuff like that, personally. Another thing we should probably talk about is the Scarecrow sections themselves, where Batman finds himself getting dosed with Scarecrow's fear gas. Though in this particular game, he also has a injection-based version as well. That is actually contained on his fingers, which is a neat little aesthetic. It leads to these interesting platforming sections where you are avoiding a giant version of Dr. Crane who threatens to swat you and then talk trash to you in the game over menu, like you just got beat up in a match of Def Jam Fight for New York.
You can't be a pimp if you get on like a hoe.
In these sections, we get to see a peek at Batman's mental state. You really get this picture that, of course, on the outside, he's a determined stoic. He's a stern superhero who's all business when it comes to what he does, and is overly confident in his ability to stop any plot that's in front of him. But there's more beneath the surface when you start to get to know him. Or rather, get to know him again if you've already been a Batman fan. Because one thing that Joker hints at in this universe, of course, is that Jason Todd has already suffered as only Jason Todd can suffer. But it's only a quick reference that you might miss, but it does explain why this version of Batman honestly seems a little bit more blunt than he did in Batman the Animated Series or Justice League Unlimited. Beneath the surface, you get this sense that Bruce still blames himself, and blames himself quite unfairly for the death of his parents. Ridiculously unfairly, to be honest with you, because he was just a kid, for God's sake. But for some reason, he has completely and totally convinced himself that as a child, he could have done something to stop Joe Glass from shooting his mom and dad. When you do the Scarecrow sections, it gives you this really sad glimpse into all of it that's going to tug on your heartstrings. You get this picture of this big, muscular, powerful man who, beneath the shell, is still this 8-year-old boy crying in an alley as the rain pours on him. Not to mention, one section actually comes across like it's taking some inspiration from Eternal Darkness, which, for those of you who don't know, Eternal Darkness is a cult horror game for the GameCube that I think any horror fan needs to play through at least once. All in all, as I describe the story of Arkham Asylum, I really feel like I'm selling the entire experience of the game short. Is the story the most complex and compelling Batman story of all time? No. But it's done so well, even though it's simple, that it's really hard to criticize it too much, because the goal was essentially a handshake. It was to bring you into Batman's world and let you live as him for about 8 to 10 hours. What we got was this easy-to-learn, hard-to-master combat system in fistfights and stealth sections that honestly make you feel way more powerful than any other stealth section in any video game I've ever played prior to this one. And it was some of the most satisfying beat-em-up style combat I had played in a long time, too. It really set a new standard of what people would expect from a superhero video game. It wasn't enough to just make a beat-em-up as your favorite hero. It wasn't enough to just have memorable web-swinging, looking at you, PlayStation 2 version of Spider-Man 2. The new standard was that if you're gonna play as a hero, you need to feel like the hero. If you can't do that, there is no point coming to the dance, baby. At some other time, I would absolutely love to revisit Arkham City and Arkham Knight, but those are stories for another time, and they're both much more lengthy than this game was, so I really feel like I would need to take a little bit more time sitting down and analyzing them, and I really didn't have the time to do a 1-hour video by myself, to be honest with you. No matter how Suicide Squad killed the Justice League turns out, I think that Rocksteady Studios and their legacy is going to be remembered as a positive one. And one that honestly changed how we look at how to make a video game based on a character and how immersive it really needs to be. The Arkham trilogy could be considered one of the greatest video game trilogies of all time, if not the greatest, and it's definitely one of my favorites ever. If you've never played Arkham Asylum, I recommend playing the PC version, but I will warn you, if you have an NVIDIA card and you turn on the PhysX effects, there are a couple sections where it's going to tank your performance, even with a more modern card. Because, admittedly, the Unreal Engine 3 and PhysX systems were not as optimized as they could have been, and even with patches afterwards, still never really got to what I would call a super stable level. Regardless, go play the game. If you haven't at this point, I really feel like, as a gamer, you have done a disservice to yourself because it really is an incredible experience. On that note, if you enjoyed this game, do me a favor. Share this video with somebody, hit the like button, subscribe, and in the comments let me know who your favorite villain in the game was. Personally, when it comes to the Arkhamverse, I actually like Scarecrow more than anybody, but that's just me. Anyway, if you want to support the channel or my comic book publishing business, Grindstone Arts, check out the links in the description to see what we got going on. With all that said, my name is Micah Curtis, your favorite vanilla gorilla, and I'll see you next time.